Darksiders 3 has arrived on Nintendo Switch. It was the last of the Darksiders games to arrive on the system after remasters of both Darksiders and Darksiders 2, along with a Switch version of Darksiders Genesis. The series has never had any groundbreaking Switch conversions, but they've all brought reasonably good results, allowing for playing the series on the go with little to no real compromises. Darksiders 3, however, is the most technically demanding game in the series. Let's get this out of the way right off the bat. There have been a lot of visual changes made to Darksiders 3 to get it running on the Nintendo Switch. It is of course important to note that unlike the first two Darksiders titles, this one wasn't originally developed for Xbox 360 and PS3, but rather Xbox One and PS4. So we're looking at a significant jump in target hardware. It's also worth noting that even on the Xbox One, Darksiders 3, to this day on current patches, has some performance issues. It's always struck me as a game that's ambition may have been a bit larger than its budget. With that in mind, I'll be comparing the Switch version both with the Xbox One version, along with that same version running on the Xbox Series X via backwards compatibility, to give us a couple different points of comparison. From a raw numbers standpoint, the Switch version, like all other versions, makes use of a dynamic resolution. Docked, this seems to hit around 720p most of the time, though obviously it can fluctuate. Meanwhile, the handheld version tends to sit closer to 540p, though I have seen it spend long periods at a higher resolution when in more enclosed environments. I also noticed that the resolution tends to run significantly higher in cutscenes, to the point where handheld mode hovers very close to native 720p. I'll also confirm that these are not pre-rendered. They may look cleaner than the regular gameplay, but they don't look that much cleaner. Frame rate is also on par with the other console versions at 30 frames per second. This highlights another challenge of porting this game to Switch. There's no easy dropping the frame rate from 60 to 30 to gain some headroom. Moment to moment, the frame rate is generally fine, though it does fluctuate during busier combat and occasionally as new areas are loaded in. In fact, just like the Xbox One version, moving too quickly through the environment can cause the game to pause briefly as it streams in more of the world. This is something that playing on the Xbox Series X fixes, but I'm not surprised to see it make a return on Switch. This also isn't a new issue to the Darksiders series, and was pretty prevalent in Darksiders 2 as well. This isn't to say that it's not annoying, merely that it isn't a specific problem inherent to the Switch version. One final note on frame rate is a pretty constant presence of bad frame pacing. You may have noticed those little bounces on the graph. Those are instances where the game is still technically outputting 30 frames, but they're not coming in at a constant rate. This can give the feeling that the frame rate is slightly jerky, even when it's technically still holding at 30. By now, just from watching this footage, you've likely picked up on plenty of the cuts made to Darksiders 3 visually to get it running. Putting it side by side with the Xbox version really does feel pretty drastic at times. It honestly reminds me of seeing comparisons between the Wii and 360 versions of Call of Duty games back in the day. They would oftentimes replicate the same scene, but look very, very different. So let's work our way down the list, and I'm pretty sure there's probably other things I'm missing. Texture resolution is pulled back significantly across the board. Characters still look good, but environments get a little soupy. Lower LODs are also used for pretty much everything in the game. It's easiest to spot here on Envy. Notice the lower polygon count on the top of her head and on her eyeballs. To me, it looks like they're just using the models one step down on the LOD scale. In all fairness, it's oftentimes not really noticeable unless you're looking really closely and have the Xbox version handy to compare it to, so overall a good change. Dynamic light sources are significantly pulled back, and the rendering of light in general has been simplified, resulting in some environments taking on a very different tone. Volumetric lighting effects seem to be absent, or at least severely reduced. You can most easily notice this in the opening cutscene, looking into the background behind Fury. The red glow of the lava is entirely absent. When playing in handheld mode, some airborne particles seem to be entirely absent, though they are still present when playing docked. Foliage has taken the Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition position, which is of course locked in place. Foliage density is also pared back, though honestly not as much as I would have expected. Ambient occlusion, which has the effect of filling corners with shade, is still present, which is good, as it contributes a lot to the visual style of the game. However, the quality has been lowered significantly, resulting in visible dithering across the entire scene. It's not really noticeable when you're playing the game handheld, but it's very obvious when playing on a TV. I also feel like the sample range of the effect is further out, creating larger shadows. This effect may in some way be tied to rendering resolution, which would explain the change, though it's also possible that the lower quality of the effect just makes it more obvious. Screen space reflections have been removed from water and replaced with a subtle, low-resolution cube map. It's a change that's very similar to what we saw in Darksiders Genesis on Switch as well. Water is also no longer transparent, which could potentially have negative effects on spotting hidden objects under its surface in a few later spots in the game. Unfortunately, we got this code very near to launch, so I haven't been able to confirm if transparency is still disabled in those instances. Now, if it is, it wouldn't make them unplayable by any means, but it could potentially make them a little bit more cumbersome. After all of that, you may expect me to give the port a lot of crap, but honestly, this sounds about right. Too often we've seen games that simply crank down the resolution and frame rate while maintaining secondary effects. Darksiders 3 doesn't always look like the other versions, but it never drops the resolution to a damaging degree either. If this is what it takes to get the game running, I'd rather a developer make these cuts than drop the resolution to the point where I can't see anything. Especially in instances like this, where cutting the frame rate in half isn't an option. But now let's talk about some improvements. Yeah, you heard me right, there's actually a couple instances in which the Switch version outperforms the Xbox One version, so let's let the little guy revel in these small victories. First of all, both the Switch and Xbox One versions suffer from plenty of texture pop-in, but on average, the Switch seems to load these in a little faster. There are actually times where texture pop-in is very obvious on Xbox One, while no pop-in is evident on Switch. Now that being said, I did have one instance where the opening cutscene just never loaded beyond the lower resolution textures, but I reset the game and I haven't been able to recreate it since, so we'll chalk that one up to a random glitch for now. But the Switch's greatest triumph over the Xbox One comes in actual loading times. Darksiders 3 takes strong influence from Souls-likes, and as a result, you'll be dying a lot. While the Series X obviously destroys both of these systems, the Switch beats out the Xbox One on respawn time by about 8 seconds on average. That being said, the loading times are still long, unless you're playing this via backwards compatibility on one of the newer systems, but the Switch version actually comes out ahead when compared to the original version. So that's Darksiders 3 on Switch. This is a somewhat odd one for technical analysis because, to be blunt, it didn't run very well on the systems it was actually designed for. So I went into the Switch version expecting the worst. While I won't act like this is some miracle port, it has honestly exceeded my expectations. It makes the changes necessary to be a fully playable version of Darksiders 3 on Switch, something that was generally thought of as being outside the realm of possibility back when the game originally launched. This is a long way off from being the ideal way to play Darksiders 3, but then again, neither were the consoles it was actually designed for. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, and consider subscribing to Nintendo World Report TV. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments below. I am currently working on my full review of Darksiders 3 for Nintendo Switch, so keep an eye out for that on NintendoWorldReport.com. You can chat with us about this or anything else on our Discord using the link in the description, and stick around for information on our Patreon. I'm John Reardon, and I will see you next time. This video was made possible by our generous supporters on Patreon. Did you know that Nintendo World Report is funded directly by fans like you? When you support Nintendo World Report on Patreon, you get immediate access to multiple exclusive podcasts every month, exclusive Discord channels, an early look at select content, and more, all for as little as $1 a month. Check out patreon.com/NWR for all the details.